Here we go again for another Yakuza game. This time, a complete spin-off with a totally new cast of characters called Judgment. There is a handful of Yakuza games that don't star Kazuma and the gang, but this is one of the most accessible ones, to me right now at least, since it's on the PS4 and relatively cheap, and doesn't have me reading a 27 volume manga before playing it. Even though I also acquired that game already, and yes, I am reading that 27 volume manga that is Fist of the North Star, cause it do be like that for a big ass nerd. Regardless, we're not here to talk about that, we're here to review what is so far the most recent game in the series that I've reviewed. I know that Yakuza 7 exists, and it is Judgment, or as it's known in Japan, Judge Eyes, which is curious because it makes it the only Yakuza game, even within the spin offs, to not have Ga Gotoku in the title, which roughly translates with context to Laika, as the Yakuza titles in Japan have the title of Ryo Ga Gotoku, as in like a dragon. Why did I say Ga Gotoku only? Then, well, that's because even the Feast of the North Star spin-off, which is much more unrelated to this series than Judgment, has Gagatoku in the Japanese title being called Hakuto Gagatoku. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, by the way, meaning like a North Star. So why do this? Why try to separate this game from the main series just by name? Because this game does take place in Kamurocho. Well, I guess that leads me to talk about the story, even though I think that will only raise more doubts than it will answer. First, let's get the facts out of the way. The story of Judgment takes place in the world of Yakuza in 2018, putting it somewhere between Yakuza 6 and 7, but no major characters from the Yakuza series make an appearance here. So what is the story actually about? Well, it's a murder mystery with courtroom drama, and of course the Yakuza are involved, because of course. But honestly, it works. It's a breath of fresh air. For this world, even the Yakuza here are composed of much smaller gangs, opposed to the almost politically influential clans like the Tojo clan. And they make note of that here. It's not a story with a smaller scope by any means, but it feels like a much more concise and personal story that connects to our main character, Takayuki Yagami, a lawyer turned detective after having presumably defending a serial killer in court and setting him free, which leads to the events of this game as Yagami is now a detective investigating a new set of correlated murders that end up correlating to the old murders as well, bringing up a whole lot of drama and investigation that you expect out of this type of story. Though it feels somewhat slow in the first half, and really only picks up in the second half of the narrative, as the first half just has a lot of setups, and a lot of these setups can be pretty obvious, and others can be somewhat deceiving, which honestly I appreciate because it makes the more obvious twists less obvious, and when the deceiving ones are proven wrong, you go like, well, thank God they didn't go with this twist. It's hard to give an example without spoiling, but very early on, a character hints hard at being the killer, but throughout the story's events, that just wouldn't make sense. And then towards the end, they reveal themselves as the killer, almost like as an inside joke between you and the game. And moments like that are cool, and show the surprisingly good writing out of this game. Part of that also because of the characters. While there is a big roster of characters, maybe even bigger than your average Yakuza game, they all feel well developed and grounded in a way that feels like the characters are living in this world and are a part of the story, which is something that other Yakuza games have had problems with for me, with these above everything kind of Yakuza bosses. There isn't much of that here. Regardless, I really enjoyed this story. It's undeniably a Yakuza game, but from a different perspective. Not like an opposing view, like a cop, but more like a middle ground of someone who has to deal with both, and it works. Moving on to the gameplay, this is where this is a Yakuza game through and through. Playing Kamurocho with all the mini games, which this game has quite a lot of new ones. Here with games like the VR Paradise, a sort of like one-player Mario Party game. Then the drone racing game, which starts off simple, but quickly becomes a very hectic racer. Then also a pinball machine in your office, along with some others, and of course the classics, like darts and baseball. Also the ones I never play, like Chogi and Mahjong. I don't know if I pronounced Mahjong right. And then the ones I try not to play too much so I don't get a gambling addiction. You know the ones. And not to forget the Sega arcade ones, of course. Still here with some returning games like Virtua Fighter 5 and Space Harrier, even Puyo Puyo. But more impressive here is the new ones. Motor Raid is a game I had never heard about, but it's surprisingly fun in a futuristic motorcycle arcade racing way where you can kick and swing weapons at your opponents. And it was a bit short but very interesting. I had never heard of this before and it was really cool. But another really cool one, and this is a wholly original one for this game, is called Kamuro of the Dead, and it's an on-rails zombie shooting game based on Yakuza Dead Souls. It is a very basic game, but what caught my attention is how it's very much Yakuza Dead Souls. They even use a lot of the monsters unique to that game, and I guess I'm just surprised that they remember this game. Overall, Kamurocho here is surprisingly new, minigame wise at least, and also adding to Kamurocho is the return of the rooftops and sewer system, here being much smaller in scope, but it works for what it's doing. You don't really need these to run around Kamurocho. The rooftops mostly get used in missions, and you mostly only use the sewers to meet up with the homeless, specifically the homeless doctor, which you will need to do to heal yourself from this new mechanic of the deadly wounds, where enemies, mostly bosses, will do a sort of special attack where if they hit you, they will not only damage you, but also partially cut off your health bar, being unable to heal past a certain point unless you go to this doctor and pay to get healed for 20,000 yen. And to get healed on the go, you have to use a med kit, which the cheapest one costs 40,000 yen. And while this is an interesting mechanic, I found that because of its possible long-term effects, especially if it happens early on in a more linear mission, where you won't have the possibility to visit a doctor, and since how expensive it is to heal yourself in the first place, especially on the go, and especially if you're focusing on doing the story and not just diving into the side missions to make money. And with this game having a very forgiving checkpoint system to go with all this, I felt I was very compelled to just let myself die and restart from a checkpoint most of the times if the wound was significant, because you can get a small cut that barely affects you, but you can also get comboed so hard you lose half your health bar, and well, that's not enjoyable. My fix for this would have been to simply make these medkits cheaper. I know it would loosen the impact of this mortal wounds, but I also find myself dying on purpose, which I think is much more deterrent to the flow of the game. Speaking of the flow of the game, because of the investigation nature of this game, there will be some moments where you'll have to play the part of a detective through gameplay. These being done through two main ways. The first person, sometimes with drone. Yes, the drone shows up a bunch in this game. Anyways, where you have to investigate an area or a picture and you have to look for clues. And honestly, it's kinda boring. There just isn't much to it. The clues are either incredibly obvious or don't make any sense at all. Like early on in the game, as you are investigating a picture of the crime scene, it has you looking at very specific places that seem randomly placed, if that makes sense. Like for example, just looking at a very specific place on the ground just to talk about, well, the ground. Or if you want to talk about the trash bags, in this scene you have to point at a very specific point in the bags. it can be such a nuisance. Personally, my recommendation is just get the upgrade that makes the controller vibrate when you're hovering over a clue. It makes these sections so much simpler. The other piece of sort of investigating is not much better, honestly. It's the tailing missions, where you slowly follow someone around and they slowly walk and randomly turn around because they feel like they're being followed, as you have to hide to not be detected. It's as boring as it sounds. I mean, it's like straight up out of some early Assassin's Creed game, except you don't even get to parkour. Now let's talk about something that's actually good, and that is the core of the gameplay. Judgment feels like somewhat of an in-between Yakuza 0 and 6, where it runs on the engine of 6 and it has that floatiness of the gameplay where it almost pushes it to the RPG side, but less so here as it takes a lot from 0 with its more extravagant combos. Yagami is a very slim and agile guy, and his movesets reflect that. Well, sort of. Much like Yakuza 0, you can change between styles on the fly here, having two styles. The Tiger style, made for one-on-one fights, making a lot of damage but not having much range. And then we have the Crane style, where you use your legs to just do a lot of roundhouse kicks and send everyone flying. Of course, being the opposite of Tiger style, here having much more range and spread, but also doing slightly less damage. In a way, these two styles kind of feel like a mix of Kazuma and Majima from Zero, Tiger being of course Kazuma, and Crane Majima. Continuing, much like every other Yakuza game, you have a sort of energy bar that lets you pull off special moves, most of which you will acquire through spending skill points, and much like every Yakuza game, they cannot stick to one leveling up system. Here having you earn skill points through missions and battles, and then spending those on a sort of catalog of moves and powers, having three main categories. The first one focusing on status of the characters, things like strength, speed and health, but also how much food heals you and how hard it is for enemies to knock you down. Then the second one is moves, but for the most part special moves, unfortunately, as one of the things this game introduces is the invincible mode, where you of course don't take damage but also have a completely different moveset and do a lot more damage. The drawback being these consume your energy bar and fast, and most of the upgrades in this category work for that mode over the regular mode, which is a bit annoying because realistically most of the time you'll be fighting in the regular mode, of course. And it doesn't help that a lot of the moves that are applied to the regular fighting mode are locked behind skill books, which you can find in the world mostly through side missions. These skill books will unlock more moves to buy in the catalog, which by itself is like, come on, just give me a free move, I already did the side mission. It's not bad, just not a huge fan of adding these extra steps for moves that should be easily accessible in my opinion, like the dodge roll being one that stands out in my mind. Regardless though, Judgment feels good. It's very much a mixture of a few games, especially 6 and 0. If there is a game you can go experimental with, is the spin-off that comes out after your final game in the series. Well, at least the Kazuma series. Moving finally to the graphics and sound, this one is interesting. Like I mentioned before, this game is running on the Yakuza 6 engine, but it looks different, primarily due to the color. That's something that I have started to notice with these modern Yakuza games, is that the developers really like to play with the color of the games to give a different feeling to Kamurocho in general. Here I think it might be going for a more bright and saturated look, and there's also just a lot more detail in everything, especially in the shadows, which might explain why they went for the more bright and white look, so these shadows popped out even more. But these additions also come at a cost, and Yakuza 6 already felt like it was stretching the PS4 power. And here, well, it sometimes goes a bit too far on the original PS4, which is where I played. Frame drops happened a bit too often, especially during crowded scenes, which in Kamurocho happens a lot. This was already a problem with the introduction of the engine as it dropped Yakuza to the 30 FPS range on consoles, and here because of these drops that problem feels even worse. Which is a shame because it is really an impressive looking game otherwise. Also, what doesn't help with this is the long loading screens. I'm not sure if they are any longer than the ones in Yakuza 6, but to me they sure felt it. Finally, sound-wise, it's getting to the point of it being a meme, but it's a Yakuza soundtrack. It sounds like Yakuza. If you heard any other music from any other Yakuza game, maybe with the exception of Zero, then you know what this sounds like. It's not bad, it's just serviceable. It sounds like a video game is the best way I can put it. And it sounds good during action scenes, but nothing you'd want to really listen to outside of the game. Regardless though, Judgment is a really good game. It's very unique and experimental in a lot of ways, while still fitting neatly into the Yakuza franchise. Not all of it works, but also a lot of it does, and I'm giving Judgment an 8 out of 10. Moving on to my recommendations, well, if you haven't played any Yakuza game, this is not a bad one to start with because it doesn't have any baggage. It's its own very self-contained story, not requiring any knowledge of other Yakuza games, whilst still feeling like one. For fans though, well, if you're looking for a change of pace, but you still want that Yakuza core, then this is also a good choice. That being said, if you're burned out on the franchise, then this won't change your opinion, as it does take place for almost its entirety in Kamurocho, and there aren't any other open world maps in this one. Regardless of your decision though, I hope this video helped you with it, and regardless of that, please consider subscribing and liking and even commenting all the things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day and goodbye.